The topic of my talk is the evolution of user experience. And the reason I'm doing this talk is because there seems to be a lot of confusion out in the industry about this profession. So my goal is to kind of explain and demystify it a bit. And in the process of doing that, I will probably be confusing you for about 3 to 5 minutes before I get some clarity. Okay? So let's get started. What is user experience? User experience is about optimizing the design of a product or system for the people who use it. In concept, it sounds simple. Okay, these are our target users. We kind of know who they are, and we have this new technology or whatever, and we're developing this product or something we're going to fit into the cabin of this car. Okay, so that usually is the way that it goes. But there's a lot of tools that we have at our disposal to make sure we do properly understand our target audience and tailor the product for them. You know, there is a technology, and then there's the interface, you know, how it works and how it's presented to the user and how they interact with it. And that's really what user experience is all about. It's about doing this optimization. And there's 3 main areas for getting a better understanding and tailoring the design. The first is understanding the desires of our end users or our target audience. And, you know, we hear about needs and wants, and then known and unknown needs and wants. The unknown needs and wants is where all of us want to be excited because we have this new technology and we want to present it to the customer and we want them to use it. But there's all kinds of pitfalls along the way. One is they may not really want it, even if they don't understand it. But once they do understand it, they either want it or they don't. So Steve Jobs and Apple Computers, I think for several decades, was known for the master of understanding unmet needs and presenting those features in a way that they would be understood, accepted, and delighted. And I think that's where we all want to play. But it's a difficult path to get to that stuff. And you know, the tools you hear are focus groups and something I'll talk about a little later, which is contextual interviews, which is working one-on-one with your target end user in the area, in the environment in which they would be using your product. So when it comes to in-cabinet vehicles, well, certainly you would get them in a simulator or in a car and understand how they would use your product or how they're using the current product if you're evolving it some way. So understanding these desires, there's a lot of techniques for getting at that. Some of it's messy and some of it's very rigorous. The other thing we have in our toolkit for getting a design right or a user experience right is that we understand humans. We have a lot of charts, tables, and standards to understand the human. You know, people are all different sizes and shapes, and they have range of knowledge and so on. And so understanding, you know, kind of the range of capabilities in terms of size, strength, reach, field of vision, even color perception, and understanding, you know, what % of the population has a problem with, say, distinguishing red and green. Those are all things that are important to use, and those are tools that we have that when we're doing design, we refer to make sure we're getting the design right, okay? So those are things that we have that are established, and they do change and update. And then probably the most recent one, by recent I mean in the last 50 or 60 years, is we've been looking a lot more at cognitive abilities. There's been tons of research done, you know, primarily for the aerospace industry to understand vigilance, attention, how long can people attend to a task? What's the appropriate level of arousal? You know, we know when people are too aroused that they make mistakes because they're nervous. And when people are under aroused, then they tend to drift off, fall asleep, not pay attention. Okay, so understanding, there's a lot of research around attention, arousal, and vigilance. You know, once again, it was primarily for the aerospace industry, certainly for people monitoring air traffic control and nuclear reactors, things like that. But that information can be translated to a consumer population, and it has been, and it is. So just to let you know, designing, optimizing the design is fine. We have tools at our disposal, and we have research methods that we can use to get that information. So the next thing I want to do is confuse you and try to demystify the understanding of what user experience is. Part of the reason there's a confusion out there among people who don't do what we do is the fact that over the decades, and depending on which industry you're in, there's various names for this profession of user experience, or optimizing the design of a product for people, okay? And this is not an exhaustive list, but it's probably 90% of the list, okay? I'm working on a presentation at the Human Factors Conference this fall with a colleague of mine, and we're digging into the history of this profession. And while we're doing it, we're trying to document the names and labels and what industry they're from and what year they were created, okay? But this is a daunting list for anybody to say, what do you do? Because if you say I'm a mechanical engineer, I may not know exactly what specialty you're in, but I have a general understanding of mechanical engineering. But if for a single profession, there's a dozen different names and labels, it's very difficult for people to understand. So highlighted here are probably the 4 labels that are most well known in the automotive industry: ergonomics, human factors, human-machine interface, or HMI, and user experience, okay? The one at the very bottom, user experience, is probably the most recent word that came out, and label came out. It came out in 1993 by Professor Donald Norman, and it was done for computer user interfaces and graphical user interfaces. That's kind of where that was born out of. The reason you see it used in the auto industry today is because that touch screen in the center of our car, which keeps growing in importance and size, is a GUI, pretty much. And so that's why user experience is the biggest name. But the 3 other highlighted ones are the ones that have traditionally been with the automotive industry. But they all do mean the same thing. Okay, so I hope I confused you and then demystified it. So the strangest name has probably the greatest meaning: ergonomics, or derived from the Greek word ergonomia, which is actually 2 words: ergon, which is translated to work or labor, and nomos, which is translated to natural laws, okay? And my first job, I was an ergonomist. And when people ask me, what do you do? I say, I'm an ergonomist. They just look at me and tilt their head like a dog that doesn't understand. And so it's a weird word, but if you understand the meaning, it probably means it's the most meaningful. The bottom line is, whatever we call it, HMI, UX, it has a long and varied history. It's gone by many names and crosses many industries today. It did not back in the 1950s. And through all this time and change, however, its purpose has remained quite focused, with a few deviations, which as I dig into the history, you'll understand. But the bottom line is, we're trying to optimize the design of a product or system for the people who use it. And it's, you know, a lot of people find it frustrating. Some people think, oh, we can do that. But the bottom line is, you have tools at your disposal. And there's methods you can use if you don't have, you know, guidelines, okay? So now let's spend a little time talking about the history of user experience. So I have a quiz question, and the quiz question is, how long ago did user experience, human factors, or HMI, how long ago did it, or when did it become important to the in-cabin design for automobiles? Does anybody have an answer on when this got started? 1910. You know, I did have a picture for a car from 1910. I don't have it in this slide deck. I don't have any pictures, but I'm going to save that and use it. Well, that's a good guess. Any others? Okay. Well, let's do this. Pillars of the professional trace the origins thousands of years. Does that make sense? Does it make sense? Automobiles, thousands of years. I have proof. Okay? So if you really trace the history, you can go back 4,000 years BC and the ancient Chinese philosophy, which you hear a lot today of Feng Shui. Typically hear about that for people designing their homes or office spaces, okay? But it also applies to in-cabin design. And, it's the best space is one in which the arrangement of objects is aligned with the space's flow of energy, okay? So if you translate that to engineering design terms, it means purposely setting the layout, materials, and colors to ensure a space that's as harmonious, balanced, and functional as possible for the person working in that space. And you can think, yeah, we want that in our car, we want that in our cabin. If you think about automotive design terms, it's optimizing the arrangement, visibility, access of your displays and controls. That's what's in the cabin, displays and controls, in cabin for the driver. So that's 4,000 years BC. I know it's a long time ago, so let's move up to today. 500 years BC. And Hippocrates, which I'm sure you've at least heard of the Hippocratic Oath, if not Hippocrates, and he allowed observation and rationality and his own genuine respect for patients in the medical industry to guide his practice. So through this, Hippocrates developed specific design principles for tools and workplaces for surgeons. So he was thinking about this 500 years BC. How do we optimize this workplace so the surgeon can work on a patient and be effective? And so when you translate what Hippocrates was doing for his workstations, automotive design terms, it's saying, let's apply observation, rationality, and respect for our drivers and passengers to guide our vehicle designs. Once again, it sounds rather fluffy, but what it requires you to do is to spend time with your target customers and end users in their vehicles or in your prototype vehicles, understanding if you're getting things right and listening and making what I would consider largely just tweaks to get it right. Okay, so let's come up to today. I'm sorry, one more piece of history, one critical moment in history, and that's 1943. During World War II, there were a lot of accidents with a number of fighter planes, okay? And specifically what was happening was the planes were landing, and instead of adjusting the flaps for the landing, the wheels would get retracted. And what resulted were a lot of accidents and destruction of planes and deaths of pilots. And this went on for years until a Lieutenant Alphonse Japanis, who actually was an industrial designer, he had diagnosed this crashing as a frequent pilot error. And here's what was going on. I know this is a messy picture, but you had two side-by-side controls, those black controls, and they were identical switches and levers. But one was for adjusting the flaps, and one was for retracting and back the wheels, okay? And you had highly trained pilots making this error. So Alphonse came up with a solution. As an immediate wartime fix, a small rubber-tired wheel was attached to the end of the wheel control and a small wedge-shaped end to the flap control on several of their airplanes. So you had something that was visually different, but just as important, it was also tactily different because those controls were right next to each other. That was the wartime fix. And once again, once the war was over, these mnemonically shape-coded wheel and flap controls were standardized worldwide, and they are still exist today in the commercial aircraft that you see, as well as the small aircraft. Shape coding, and that's just as important today as it was back then. And it's even something important to consider for automotive design. I know sometimes that goes against the aesthetics and so on, but it's something to at least think about. So most of the ergonomics, human factors, HMI, UX work was being done for aerospace, okay? And what happened is there was a transition after the 50s to the consumer market. And this has only grown since 1960. In 1960, the first non-military applied human factors group was started in the US at a company called Eastman Kodak, a photographic company where they made cameras, film, and so on. And coming to the consumer market and out of the military, of course, a lot of the focus was on workplace optimization for safety and productivity. You had a lot of areas where they were making, assembling cameras, film processing, paper, and all the things that went out along with photographic equipment. And you also had these people, specialized people, working on the equipment design for the production environments, okay? But the other thing that got started in the 60s was consumer products design, because Kodak, from its inception, they had professional film market where trained professionals would use the cameras, but they also realized there was money to be made in the consumer market. So they did all kinds of things to make picture taking by consumers affordable and understandable. Okay, and a lot of innovations happened in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. I joined Kodak in 1986, 26 years after they got started, and I worked almost exclusively on consumer products for 12 years. So coming up to today, this profession, which in 1960 left aerospace or expanded into consumer products, it's now across almost every industry, from medical, consumer, Internet of Things, automotive. And it focuses on optimizing the design of products and system interfaces for the people who use them. So if you want to know what's important, it depends on what the product is and what the user is. For some things, like websites and some consumer products, it's just being able to pick up and use the product without training. Okay? When it comes to automobiles, in North America, the average American gets their driver's training between age 15 and 18. That's it. So as the decades go on and we're throwing all this new technology to assist or delight the drivers, how do they learn this stuff? It can be overwhelming, or worse, they cannot know the product's feature is there, and they may not use it because they don't understand it. The first time I drove a Hyundai car when I started working for them in 2014, the newest car I had was 12 years old. So I'm driving down the road, I set the cruise control, and I'm driving down the highway, and all of a sudden, my car is slowing down. So I thought the cruise control was failing. But that's because I didn't understand what adaptive cruise control was. To me, in my mind, cruise control worked a certain way. That's our biggest challenge today. And the reason it's such a big challenge is that when you put somebody in a car, from the time they drive off the lot, they start the engine and they drive. And when the driver's driving down the road, that is their primary task. And everything they do other than that is a secondary or tertiary task, which means they have dramatically less attention to give to understanding, to digging through menus, to finding something or understanding something. So the biggest challenge is, how do we serve information and features up to our drivers so that they know they're there, so they can access them, and so they can use them. So in the automotive industry, when you talk about our profession applied, it's usually focusing on the infotainment system, which I did for many of my years, but it's also the controls and displays. any controls and displays in the car, as well as anything you consider a touch point, okay? So it can be inside or outside of the car, okay? And the classic term ergonomics is applied to a lot of things that are physical for reach, vision, and so on, and some things are just for cognition and understanding. So the way we tackle it is three things I talked about early on. One was understanding human capabilities, which we have a lot of information on. Another thing is the standards that are available to us, that some that we have to follow, some that are more guidelines. And then the third thing we have in our toolkit is user research. And that can be focus groups, that can be surveys, but more importantly, it's usually product testing with the target audience, okay? And there's like two ways of doing that. One is called contextual interviews, which is working one-on-one and working in context, in the car, in the simulator, or in a consumer's current vehicle to understand what else they need. And then the other thing we do is usability testing. And we do it with existing products, with competitive products, with prototypes and engineering models, or even with product concepts. And because I'm at the end of my time, I want to leave a few minutes for questions. So thank you very much. Oh man, it's going to be fun, because I was at a session yesterday afternoon on auditory in the vehicles, and there's some dramatic change afoot. You know, first there's warning beeps, and then there's messages and verbal messages and spear cons, which are very short verbal messages. But something that I think is coming, and it may already be here, is something I've been calling conversation with the car, which is when you think about the driver, especially the drivers alone in the car, being able to have an actual dialogue with the vehicle, a natural language dialogue with the vehicle. And I think that is one place, one thing that's really going to take off, and I think it's not going to replace the controls and displays, but I think it's going to augment them in an amazing way. I'm not involved in that area of research. My perception is that the technology is there, and it's all about implementation. The other thing that I want to leave you with is, and the reason I've stayed in the auto industry so long, is when I came here as a human factors guy, I had a unique challenge which I'd never encountered before, because everything I'd done to date was people interacting with something they can look directly at and think only about. And all of a sudden, we have the situation of a driver who's driving down the road, and everything else they do with much less attention. So how do you optimize a secondary or tertiary interaction display? And that's just been fascinating to me. Now, as we have increasing levels of automation, our newest challenge is people can now not attend primarily to driving. But what we have to do is figure out how to re-engage them, alert them, get them to focus back on the road and driving when it's required. And that I see as a really big challenge. I've been reading the research that's going on, and you know, there's not super definitive answers yet, but they're coming. Two things. Okay. I'm really sorry we're out of time, but I'll be around after, on the break if you want to talk more. I thank you very much.